This is the third part of a series of lectures on Enrique Dussel's Philosophy of Liberation, Chapter 2, entitled From Phenomenology to Liberation. So we're going to look at sections 2.4 and 2.5 of Chapter 2 in this talk, and that takes us back to the question of place, which is so important for the philosophers we've been studying this semester. So back to the question then of exteriority, and exactly what does Dussel mean by that? He says in 2411 that exteriority is the most important category for liberation philosophy. So let's take him at his word. This is the key to trying to figure out what he means ultimately by liberation and what that might mean for us. So what does that mean? What does exterior mean? He writes, it means beyond, vis-a-vis the horizon of the system or of being, of our desires and its projects, exterior to totality as determined by and as part of totality, an internal transcendence, an internal transcendence. So this brings to mind something that we might have talked about briefly in our discussions of Javier Zubiri's Man and God. God for Zubiri is transcendent, of course, but not transcendent to reality, not somehow outside of reality, because that would mean God is unreal. So that can't be right. What Zubiri wants to say is God is transcendent in reality, transcendent in reality. And I think that's what Dussel's doing here. The exterior to the totality is determined by and is a part of totality. Remember that word totality means our world, the way the world shows up, what has meaning for us, what has value for us, where all the parts fit, where things make sense, and those parts that don't make sense are ignored or denied or repressed or even oppressed. So what we're looking at is how exteriority becomes visible, if possible, in a system that doesn't really want to see it. In 2481, he has a clarification and writes, the category of exteriority, as said above, is misunderstood when what is beyond the ontological horizon of the system is thought of in an absolute total way, without any participation in the interior of the system. To avoid this misunderstanding, exteriority must be understood as transcendentality interior to totality. So the exteriorized is that which is not showing up, that which is not a part, that which is not a fit. But it's not radically outside that totality, because if it were fully, completely, absolutely exterior, it wouldn't show up. We've talked about this before. It would be like the idea in cosmology of alternative universes. Those universes don't intersect. So if there are alternative universes, there's no bridge to them. They're beyond our universe, because the universe is all that there is. And if there's alternatives, well, we can't experience that. We wouldn't know. It doesn't show up on our radar. Well, the same thing is going on here. Exteriority must be understood as transcendentality, or something that goes beyond the totality, but that is still interior to that world, that being, that particular phenomenology that lets things show up or not show up. No person as such is absolutely and only a part of the system. All, including even those who are members of an oppressing class, have a transcendentality with respect to the system interior to it. Now, here is this point about who is liberation for. In the end, it's for everybody. It's not only, although it is primarily and first of all, about liberation of the oppressed, the outcast, the downtrodden, the nobodies. It's first about them. But in the process of that liberation, if it's genuine, all will be liberated, because no one, not even the winners, are reducible to their winning in a system. There's more to us human beings, more to us that transcends our labels, our categories, the way we see ourselves, the way we talk about ourselves within a certain given system, which we're always in. But there's always something that exceeds that. There's always something that goes beyond that. And liberation is in large part, about that in each of us, that transcends the system, that in each of us is exterior to the totality. Everyone is both always inside and outside the cave. We talked about that at the beginning of the semester. Who got outside the cave? Is it the one escaped prisoner? Is that all? Is it only those who are operating the puppets, the cardboard cutouts that are creating the reality for the cave dwellers? Or who exactly? We learn that no one can be human outside of the cave, whatever that cave is, whether that's our embodiment, whether that's language, whether that's culture, whether that's the system of being, as Dussel might put it. No one can fully get outside of that, leave that all behind, and be no place. That's utopic thinking. No one can be there. We're always in place. That means we're always in a cave, if you want to put it that way. But are we completely determined by that cave? Is there always something that has a glimpse outside that cave? Well, that's the question we asked early, and it's a question we're still working on. For Levinas, it's the face, the wholly other, that for Dussel serves to remind us of a proximity lost. Remember, Dussel says we begin our lives in proximity, close to each other, close to our mothers, inside of our mothers. And the progress of our existence pushes us apart from each other. And what Levinas and Dussel following says, the face of the other, particularly the suffering other, brings us back, snaps us out of our sleepwalking through life, and returns us to the possibility of that proximity, that primordial proximity. But the face of the other is often, almost always, just another thing, right? He writes in 2421, generally, the face of the other person figures in our environment as just one more sense thing. The taxi driver seems like a mechanical prolongation of the automobile, the housekeeper as one more instance of cleaning and cooking, the teacher as an ornament of the school, the soldier as just another member of the army. It seems difficult to detach other persons from the system in which they are inserted. The person is just another being, a part of the system. I've made this point in previous lectures that we tend to not see other people as people. However, it can happen, right? Sometimes it's different. It's different when there's a cry for help. In 2422, he writes, the face of the person is revealed as other, in other words, an other person, when it is extracted from our system of instruments or tools for getting things done, as exterior, as a freedom that questions, provokes, and appears as one who resists instrumental totalization. Instrumental totalization. What does that mean? We look at people the way we look at things, the way we look at tools. This is coming from Heidegger's Being and Time again. The idea that our first encounter, our primary encounter with the world is in using things, in wearing our shoes and hammering. For Heidegger was his example. We just hammer. We don't think about hammers. We don't have a theory about hammers. We don't conceptualize them. We pick them up and start pounding nails because we're trying to build something like a bookcase or whatever. Same thing with all the other objects in the world. We're not paying attention to them as such. We're just in the midst of using them. We wear our clothes, we drive our cars. That's it. And we tend to treat people as if they were an instrument like that, as part of our totalization, part of our proyecto, part of our world, our referential system of significance. We fit them in there as useful pieces that help us get done what we want to get done. But Dussel's saying a person is not a something, but a someone, right? Remember, Zubiri says that we treat other persons as other persons, right? Just as Dussel would say, instruments, tools for our getting around in the world, no different from the cash register as the cashier, no different from the taxi as the taxi driver. But we can also treat other persons as other persons. Right? Treat others in proximity, Dussel would say, not as proxemic. Remember, proxemic for Dussel is bringing something close, to use it, to buy it, to sell it, to manipulate it, to own it. Proximity is a kind of being with that lets the other person be the other that they are. He writes, in this case, exteriority means, quote, the ambit or the field or the place whence other persons as free and not conditioned by one's own system and not as part of one's own world, the referential system of significance and meaning, according to our projects, that's where they reveal themselves, right? That's that space we're hoping to open up. And he writes that persons are beyond being. Persons beyond being, beyond the comprehension of the world, beyond the sense constituted by the interpretation supplied by one's own system. That's what Dussel means by phenomenology, that structure, that logic of how things are allowed to show up or not. Transcending persons are the determinations and conditions of one's totality, can reveal themselves in what Dussel calls an epiphany, as in opposition to us, can rebuke us even in the extreme humiliation of prison, in the cold of the cell and the total pain of torture. Even when the body is nothing but a quivering wound, a person can still cry, I am another, I am a person, I have rights. Persons are beyond being. Only the free person, each person, is the self-substantive, autonomous other totality. Metaphysical exteriority, the most real reality beyond the world and being. Well, okay, that passage is a bit of a mouthful, but what he's trying to get at here is if you want to get to the real reality beyond being, and for him, being just means a certain kind of set of lenses, an ideology, a way things show up, a phenomenology, an ontology. If you want to get to real reality beyond those limited ways of seeing and experiencing things, what is that? That is the person as such, the most real reality. Dussel is really turning the idea of totality, the horizon of meaning, he's turning it back on itself. If you want to get to the real totality, that's the person, not the world as it's been constructed, for us in terms of, capitalism, let's say, in our world, not 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 that totality, because that's not the totality. It doesn't have everything. It's leaving something out. Something is still exterior to that. The person, as person, is the real totality. John Caputo would call that the singularity. Caputo objects to a way of looking at ourselves that says each one of us is a particular instance or example of a universal, this relationship between the particular and the universal. So for us, on that view, the universal is humanity, human. Humanity is the ideal. Humanity is what Plato would call the form. It's the unifying feature, allegedly, of us. And each one of us is just one instance, one particular instance of that universal. It's called a universal because it applies to everything across the category that we're talking about here. So universally, you and I are human. Each one of us, though, is a particular human being. And Caputo says that misses something. That's trying to force each one of us to conform to the same. The universal gives us a sameness, a repetitive quality. Oh, there's another one of those humans, one more of the same. And Caputo wants to say that each one of us is a singularity with a proper name and a certain place, and has never before been and never will be again. Utterly unique, a singularity. And anytime you try to put things in the boxes, even saying, oh, well, that's a particular example of this universal, that's a token of this particular type of thing, you're cutting corners, you're missing something. There's something that exceeds the grasp, the comprehension that you're trying to get of that person, the singularity. Dussel says that a person originates in a uterus, not in someone else's determination, right? You're not born out of a category. You're not born out of an idea. You're born out of your mom. And he says we're free of all those determinations. We're free at birth. And that calls to mind the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who said very famously, man is born free and is everywhere in chains. I think Dussel's project is akin to something that Rousseau is working on. That would be a long conversation, I guess. So there are two logics then that Dussel wants to point out. The logic of totality, which is a totalitarian logic, a way of thinking about things. It's structured in terms of identity and difference. Identity being the system, the being, the proyecto, the universal, and difference being the non-being, the outcast, what separates out the particulars, identity and difference. But there's also a logic of exteriority or a logic of alterity that Dussel wants to promote. And that is structured not in terms of identity and difference, like how far are you off from the same, from being identical, another one of us. It's more structured in terms of distinction and convergence. All persons are born distinct from their origin forever, he writes. And then convergence. So to clarify, he writes, distinction convergence is opposed to identity difference. Persons distinct in their real constitution as a contingent or free thing converge, reunite, approach other persons. Convergence will be goodness, justice, fulfillment, service, liberation. Beyond being, persons converge in extra systemic future reality. Right? There's more than we have in the current world system. Another world is possible. Liberation is futural, it's forward thinking, where we, in our diversity, our unbridgeable diversity, can converge, not by becoming the same and cutting corners and cutting out and oppressing and repressing what doesn't fit, but converging as persons who are exterior to any possible ideology, any possible system of being, any possible structured phenomenology, any way of being categorized. There's more to us than that. And liberation for Dussel would consist in a convergence, a coming closer, more in proximity, as he would put it, than the system allows. The face of the other, this exterior, the thing that doesn't fit, reveals itself as a provocation, a claim upon that being, system, totality, proyecto, ideology, phenomenology, ontology, all those blue coded words in the talks, in the slides. The other person is a person as an imploring, revealing, provoking face. The real person, not persons as other, as tools, as instruments, but as persons. And the poor persons have an absolute right against the system, Dussel wants to say, and perhaps argue. The poor provoke, call forth justice. The other is a provocation. And he makes an interesting observation here in 2452. You might take a look at this, think about this a little bit. He says, that is why the faces that are taken care of with beauty aids and rejuvenated by facelifts and cosmetics of the oligarchies, aristocracies, and bourgeoisies, be they of the center or of the periphery, are faces that, like mummies, want to escape the contingencies of time. The eternalization of the present, in terror of the future, is the obsession of every dominating group. If I'm dominate, I don't want anything to move. I don't want anything to change. I want today to be every day. I want it to be exactly the same tomorrow as a day. I don't want a future. I just want now to stay now forever because I'm in charge. That's an obsession of every dominating group, Dussel writes. On the contrary, the withered face of the Bedouin of the desert, the nomad, the furrowed and darkened skin of the peasant, the poisoned lungs of the miner whose face never sees the sun. These apparently ugly faces, almost horrible for the system, we want to deny. We cover them up with cosmetics and facelifts and we hide them. These faces are the primary, the future, the popular beauty, the beauty of real people, being suffering people at the moment, but people. And to hide them cosmetically is to deny the reality of a system that withers these faces and poisons these lungs. Then he talks about Robinson Crusoe. I don't know if you know that story, but Crusoe's a castaway on an island, and he's got to figure out how he's going to be on that island. He's by himself, except for when Friday shows up. Um, anyway, he make a point here. Robinson Crusoe, had he been born alone, not cast away on the island, but born alone, would not have been free, but only spontaneous. Freedom versus spontaneity. That's something Dussel wants to distinguish here. If he were born alone, he wouldn't have been free, just spontaneous. Moreover, he would not have been a human being, a person, because persons recognize and develop themselves as persons in proximity, never in solipsistic farness. That word solipsism, you can hear solo in there, just me. A solipsistic view is just, there's just me, just my idea, just me. No, persons develop themselves in proximity and nearness. Crusoe would have been an animal whose rationality would have remained purely potential. He would not have had a world simply because no one would have given sense to things. No one is an island, and if you were born alone, which is impossible, as a human being, you wouldn't be a human being. Human beings start out in proximity, in closeness. Now, this calls to mind something I believe we may have mentioned earlier in the course. I want to repeat it again. From the philosopher Isaiah Berlin, his two kinds of liberty, according to Berlin. The first is he calls negative liberty. It's freedom from constraints, no coercion or interference. The people in our current times who are objecting to wearing masks are operating on an idea of negative liberty. I want freedom from masks. I don't want anybody telling me what to do. I want to be able to do whatever I want, whenever I want to do it. I don't want a coercion or interference. But Berlin says there's another kind of liberty he calls positive liberty. It's freedom for. It's freedom for becoming your true self. It's literally a kind of self-rule, an autonomy. Again, in the case of the current idea of having to wear masks, positive liberty would see that wearing the mask frees us up to come closer together than we could have if we're worried about the virus. It frees us up to start reopening businesses and starting to do things again. It frees us for being able to do things. So there's a freedom from, I don't want to wear a mask, but but perhaps ironically or paradoxically, that freedom is a kind of a chain, right? That spontaneity, I just want to do what I want, whatever I want. And I don't have any telos, I don't have any goal. I just don't want anybody telling me what to do. I don't want to wear this mask. Prevents us from coming close together without spreading the virus, as is rampant at the moment right now because of those kind of behaviors. But you could see a positive liberty, a different understanding of freedom, a freedom for being able to do things if, like we have at our university, taken a great number of precautions. We've disciplined ourselves to do things in a certain way so we can continue to operate and not have to shut everything down. You've probably heard me use the example of an advanced chemistry laboratory. If you say, here's an advanced chemistry laboratory with all kinds of chemicals of various kinds and equipment and Bunsen burners aflame, and go ahead, do whatever you want. Right? If I went into a lab like that with my current state of knowledge of chemistry and those kind of advanced pieces of equipment, I would probably injure myself, if not blow up the entire lab. I have negative liberty. No one's telling me what to do, but I really can't do anything because I am free, unencumbered by any kind of discipline. But if I develop the discipline necessary to understand chemistry and physics and the advanced equipment and how things operate and what I can do with them, I might be able to do great things in that chemistry lab. I'd be freed for doing those things if I had the discipline to do that. I could freely choose to do great things in that lab because I have now a positive liberty. It's about not just mere potential, as Zuberiad says, but capacities. I would be capacitated. I would have the opportunity and the abilities to do things that I choose to do rather than just let things happen to me. So it's not saying that positive liberty is the only type of liberty we should accept. That's not Berlin's point, and it's not my point. It wouldn't be Dussel's point. Uh, it's just to recognize the tension between those two types of liberty, the necessity of both, but the tension between them. If we only had a kind of positive liberty, then we'd be back to Rousseau, who that's the philosopher who says man is born free and is everywhere in chains. He's also a philosopher who said that human beings have to be forced to be free. And if they're not free, then you can re-educate them and discipline them. That doesn't sound too good, right? That way lies a bunch of problems as well. So their negative liberty needs to step up and say, "Oh, hey, hold on a second now. You can't just be forcing everybody to do whatever you want. How do you know what you want is the right thing?" But on the other hand, if you leave out the concept of positive liberty, we have all the problems of an ignoramus in a chemistry lab. It's just going to be problems. So Dussel's idea of free. Remember, he's distinguishing between free and spontaneous. Dussel's idea of free maps onto positive liberty. That's kind of ultimately what we want. Spontaneous maps onto negative liberty by itself. And the point is, we do want to be ultimately free for being who we can be, who we really can be, and not just how we're labeled. He writes in 2551. The other, who is not different, as totality asserts, but distinct, like always other, like Zubir would say diverse, who has a history, a culture, an exteriority, has not been respected. The center has not let the other be other. It has incorporated the other into a strange foreign totality, foreign to the other, not foreign to me, not part of my totality. It's foreign for them. They've been pulled into this, labeled, categorized. To totalize exteriority, to systematize alterity, to deny the other as other is alienation. It's an important word. We'll have to talk a little bit about it. Dussel says, and there's more to it than this. Dussel says to alienate is to sell someone or something, to pass it on to another proprietor. Literally, alien means foreign. So to alienate means to make foreign, to make strange. The alienation of a people or of a single individual makes its victims lose their being by incorporating them as a moment, an aspect, an instrument of another's being. I would have to say that he's not being, from my point of view, not being completely careful on his use of being here, or maybe he is, but let's just remember the subtlety. My color-coded map says being is blue. Being is something that Dussel wants to critique. I say, too cavalierly that it's bad. It's unavoidable, is better, but he wants to critique it, show its conditions of possibility, show its limitations, show how being structures who gets to be and who doesn't, what gets to count and what doesn't. Victims would want to lose their being if we're talking about the being of the system, the totality which oppresses them or represses them. They would want to lose, if that's their being, they would prefer something else. I get that. But what he is trying to say is they don't get to be themselves. They just get to be an instrument or a tool in somebody else's big project, in somebody else's totality, in somebody else's version of being, and what counts and what doesn't, as we've been talking about. So that's what he's talking about there. That those who are exteriorized from within the system are alienated from the system that's supposed to be. The ideology is for everybody. So it's probably good to just have a quick discussion of what Marx says about alienation, because I think in some ways it clarifies what Dussel wants to say and elaborates on it. So Marx says we're alienated under capitalism, the Uberprojekto of today, on 4 accounts. First of all, human beings under that system are alienated from the products of their works. And remember, Marx is writing not in the time of technology and finance capitalism. He's writing in the times of industrial capitalism, factories, right? And he says we work on assembly lines and office cubicles. We only see a fragment of the finished product. If you're working on an assembly line, you're just putting one part on. You're not a craftsperson building an entire product. At the end, you just play a little role. If you work in an office, like, you don't get to see the big picture of everything that goes on in that corporation. You see your little bit. So everything becomes kind of fragmentary. We labor, but the fruits of our labor become commodities that are bought or sold by others. I make something, but I don't get to keep it, and I don't get to sell. Other people sell it and buy it. And sometimes we work on products that kill us. Some people work in cigarette factories, and some people work in gun factories. And we become alienated from the products of our work. They're strange to us. They're not really maybe what we would make. And then Mark says that we become alienated from working. Now, you might have heard me talking about my grandkids and how busy they are. They get up in the morning, they have their little cereal, and they get immediately to work. My littlest one of the four, he gets busy. He builds something up, then he knocks it down. He builds something up, then he knocks it down. He does that until lunch. Now, he doesn't have a boss. No, he doesn't punch a clock. Nobody told him what to do. We naturally desire to be creative and do different things. But we have to forego all that in order to labor for those who own the means of production. So a lot of people don't like work. They resent that they have to work. They struggle with the idea that they have to go do something else. And you could do a self-test on this little thought experiment. If you had all the money in the world, would you still have the same major you have now? If you had all the money in the world, would you be aiming to do what you're aiming to do at the moment, or would you do something different? If somebody could say, look, I don't know how much money you have, but I guarantee you, you will always have a roof over your head. You will always have food in your stomach. You will always have health care. You will always have freedom of movement. That I can guarantee. Right? You will always have transportation. I can guarantee that. I'm not saying you'll have all the money in the world, but you will always have that, no matter what. A roof over your head, food on the table, health care. You'll have all the basics. It's guaranteed you'll have that. What would you do? Would you still be on the same track? Well, Marx is wondering whether we would. We like to labor, right? We talked about this with A. Korea. Humans labor. That's what helps to complete us as human beings. We do things. We make things. We're poetic. We make things. We're creative. But work under capitalism, Marx and A. Korea and Dussel are talking about, is a different kind of a thing altogether. We have to go to somebody else who's got their own project and say, could you let me in on it? Because I need a roof over my head. I need food in my belly. Humans are also alienated from themselves. It's kind of a race to the bottom. We sell ourselves. And, those of you who are seniors, you're probably already thinking about getting out there. And, what do they tell you with your resume? You know what you got to do? You got to market yourself. You got to market yourself like you're a product. I don't know. I'm just trying to think what another word would be for somebody who tries to sell themselves for somebody else's uses or pleasure. I don't know. I can't really come up with the word, but maybe you could come up with it. But we do that under this system. And then finally, he says, humans under capitalism are alienated from each other. We're in competition to sell our labor to the lowest common denominator. There's only so many jobs. I'll say, I'll do it for 10. And somebody says, well, there's only one job, two of us. Maybe I'll do it for 9. Right? It keeps us at the lowest possible rung overall. Overall, again, there are some winners, no doubt, in that system. But at least this is how Marx was seeing it. And I think Dussel would agree with a lot of this, even though times have radically changed from the industrial society, at least in the United States, where I'm talking from today. There's still elements of that I think are worth pondering. And so to wrap up this section, he wants to introduce the idea of an ethos, and it's a Greek word. It comes from etike, and if you trace it back, it's really a word that is related to music. If you had a guitar with 6 strings and you plucked any given string, it just makes a note, and the note just is what it is. It just is what it is. Whatever the sound is, it is what it is. But if you strum all 6 strings on the guitar and those notes are not in tune with each other, it sounds horrible. It sounds terrible. But if all those notes are in tune with each other, then it makes a beautiful sound when you strum it. So that word got taken over into our practices, and you can hear it in Aristotle. When you're doing the right thing, you're in tune with yourself, you're in tune with others, you're in tune with the world, and you're being as best that you can be. So ethos is a kind of attunement. It's the way we do things around here. That's how we're tuned up with each other. Now, but what's that? How is it tuned? Right. That's going to be his question. And he writes, the moral character of a people or a person is the ethos. Right. It is the structural whole of attitudes that predetermine action. Right. It's supposed to be guidance. It's supposed to direct you to how you do things, the way we do things around here, the way one does, the way they say. The ethos of domination, be it imperialist, that would be, the United States and Europe at the time of Dussel wrote this, or dependent national, that would be the ethos of countries in Latin America as they're dominated from the outside, and dependency, we talked about that, revolves around the mystification in the form of reigning customs or virtues of what were vices in the time of oppression. What does that mean? He says, well, look, the ethos, the way we do things around there, the way we're tuned up is a form of repression. It predetermines a variety, maybe the fundamental behaviors of a society. And it leads to a kind of self-repression, making it difficult or impossible to resist that domination. Again, I just suggest a kind of a thought experiment to test. We should always test what these thinkers say, whether we think they're all right or all wrong or partially right, partially wrong. You got to be critical when you hear this. But he says, look, the ethos of our society is making it very difficult for you and me to do otherwise than we're doing right now. Right? The way we look at things, the way we think a person ought to be, the way we think society ought to be, the way we think about those things, we self-repress. There's parts of us that would love to do something else, but we won't. We can't. We couldn't imagine. We can't think of it. We have to tamp down that thought. No. I mean, I got to live. I got to have a roof over my head. So the ethos, the way we do things around here, leads to a kind of self-repression, and vices start to appear as virtues. So if you look at various virtues like patience, obedience, fidelity, patriotism, frugality, those words all sound good to us, right? You were probably taught from a young age that you should be patient, you should be obedient, you should be faithful, you should be a patriot and love your country, you should be frugal. Well, what patience? What patience in enduring injustice? Obedient to somebody who's making you do something that ultimately you don't want to do? Faithful to something that has no faith in return in you? Patriotism, the country being the government, not being all the people, but the government does whatever, and you have to respect it and love it. Frugality, what does that mean? Not paying people everything that they deserve, so it keeps money in your own pocket? Well, if you look at it that way, those are all vices. Those aren't good habits to be in, they're bad habits to be in. Dussel writes, in this way, when the resentful oppressed of yesterday become the dominators of today, they present as virtues their old vices mystified. The avarice, the greed of the poor, persecuted inhabitant of the medieval town, the bourgeois, is now the virtue of thrift. Right? Once upon a time, there were manor towns, and the people who worked in the towns and the small business owners said, "Hey, I'm tired of being pushed around by the manor lord. I want what's mine. I want more than what's mine." All right. Well, when you get it, then you keep it, and you say, "Oh, well, you got to keep, you got to save, don't share." All right. Now that vice of greed starts to look like a pretend virtue, a mystified version of a virtue. The virtues of the center and the dominating classes are alienation in the periphery and dominated classes. Right? What we get taught as virtues estrange those at the periphery, those who've been exteriorized, those who are being dominated, oppressed, and repressed. That pushes them away from themselves in all the ways we talked about. And if you want to read more about this, we don't have time. We talk about this in Moral Foundations course. Philosopher Lisa Tessman's book, Burden Virtues, is a really good essay on this idea of vices starting to seem like virtues, bad habits starting to be habits you ought to develop, and then you call them habits you ought to develop, you call those virtues, the tension between those. And also, I would recommend an essay by philosopher Virginia Held, Feminist Transformations in Moral Theory, which again shows that there is a patriarchal thread that runs throughout the history of moral philosophy that teaches to do certain things that would be virtuous or good from a particular point of view, but not from all points of view. So those are worth thinking about. You can check into that for yourself if you get interested. All right, that's enough for this section. We got one more section of chapter 2, and then we'll move on from there, and we'll pick it up next time.